In the late 1980s, the state of California created an official government task force with a specific mission, raising the self-esteem of its citizens, on the theory that low self-esteem was a root cause of crime, teenage pregnancy, drug abuse, and academic failure. Schools handed out participation certificates. Children were taught affirmations to repeat in the mirror. Bulletin boards filled with slogans about how special and unique every student was. Years later, researchers went back to measure whether any of it had worked. The results were, by most honest accounts, disappointing. Self-reported self-esteem scores sometimes rose. Actual outcomes, academic performance behavior, resilience under stress, largely did not follow. In some studies, the relationship ran the other direction entirely, with inflated self-esteem correlating with more aggression and less accountability, not less. Nathaniel Branden, a psychotherapist who had spent more time thinking rigorously about self-esteem than almost anyone else writing in this genre, watched this entire movement unfold with open frustration. He did not believe self-esteem was unimportant. He believed the popular movement built around it had gotten the mechanism almost completely backward, treating self-esteem as something to be handed to a person through praise and encouragement, when in his view it could only ever be built the way any other durable psychological structure is built, through a specific, effortful set of internal practices, repeated consistently over time. His book lays out exactly what those practices are, not slogans, not affirmations recited without underlying substance. 6 specific, disciplined habits of mind and action that he argues are the actual load-bearing structure of genuine self-esteem, the kind that holds up under real pressure rather than collapsing the moment external validation stops arriving. Branden's foundational definition matters before any of the 6 pillars make sense on their own. He argues self-esteem is built from 2 distinct components that have to be present together. The first is self-efficacy, a basic confidence in your own mind, your ability to think, to learn, to make sound decisions, and to cope with the ordinary challenges of life. The second is self-respect, a sense that you are worthy of happiness, respect, and your own achievements, not because you have earned it through some external scoreboard, but because you consider yourself at a fundamental level a person of value. Branden's argument is that most approaches to self-esteem focus almost entirely on the second component, trying to make people feel worthy through praise and encouragement, while almost completely neglecting the first, the actual competence and consciousness that self-efficacy requires. And that neglect is precisely why so many popular self-esteem interventions produce inflated feelings without any of the underlying substance to support them. In this video, I want to walk through all 6 of these practices in real depth, what each one specifically requires, why Branden considers it foundational rather than optional, and where, honestly, both his framework and the broader self-esteem research it sits inside deserve a more skeptical read than the book's confident tone always invites. This is a longer breakdown than usual because the subject deserves the space. Stay with me. The practice of living consciously. Branden treats this as the foundational pillar, the one the other 5 ultimately depend on. Living consciously means operating with a genuine respect for facts, including uncomfortable ones, rather than retreating into denial, distraction, or willful vagueness whenever reality becomes inconvenient. It means paying attention deliberately to what is actually happening in your work, your relationships, and your own internal state, rather than drifting through decisions on autopilot. The specific mechanism Branden describes is that self-efficacy, confidence in your own mind, cannot be built while that mind is habitually avoiding accurate information about your own life. Every act of denial, however small, quietly teaches the mind that it cannot be trusted to handle reality, and that lesson accumulates. A person who consistently avoids looking clearly at a failing relationship, a financial problem, or a pattern of self-sabotage is not protecting their self-esteem by looking away. They are steadily eroding it, because some part of the mind always registers the avoidance, even when the conscious attention does not. He is specific about what this practice does not require. It does not mean obsessive self-analysis or constant introspection. It means a general orientation toward clarity over comfort, a willingness to ask what is actually true here, even when the honest answer is unwelcome, and to let that answer inform your next action rather than being managed away through distraction. Branden also connects this pillar to a broader pattern he observed repeatedly in his clinical work, which he calls the avoidance of the obvious. Clients would frequently arrive already knowing, at some level, exactly what was wrong in a relationship or a career, and yet had never allowed that knowledge to surface into conscious, actionable awareness, because doing so would have required acting on it. Living consciously, in his framing, is precisely the discipline of not allowing that gap to persist, closing the distance between what you already sense and what you are willing to admit you know. The practice of self-acceptance. This pillar is frequently misunderstood, Branden argues, as a kind of unconditional self-approval, liking everything about yourself regardless of the facts. His actual definition is considerably more precise and more demanding. Self-acceptance means refusing to be at war with yourself, acknowledging the full reality of your thoughts, feelings, and actions, including the ones you are not proud of, without denial and without self-punishment either. The specific distinction he draws is between acceptance and approval. Accepting that you acted out of fear or handled a situation poorly does not require approving of that behavior or deciding it was acceptable. It requires acknowledging, honestly, that it happened, that it came from you, and that pretending otherwise does not actually undo it. It only adds a second layer of dishonesty on top of the original mistake. Branden argues this distinction matters enormously in practice, because the alternative to genuine self-acceptance is not high standards. It is usually a cycle of denial followed by harsh self-judgment, which he considers far more corrosive to self-esteem than honestly acknowledged imperfection ever is. He extends this specifically to disown parts of the self, feelings or impulses a person has learned, often in childhood, are unacceptable to have at all, and has since pushed out of conscious awareness rather than simply managed. Branden argues that self-esteem cannot be fully stable while entire categories of one's own inner experience remain off-limits to honest acknowledgement, because the energy required to keep them suppressed is itself a continuous, quiet drain on the same psychological resources self-esteem depends on. He offers a specific practical distinction that clarifies how this plays out day to day. Feeling anger at someone you love is not, in his framing, a character flaw requiring denial. Pretending the anger is not there, while it continues to shape your behavior indirectly through irritability or distance, is where the actual damage occurs. Acknowledging the feeling honestly, even privately, and then deciding deliberately how to act on it, is the version of self-acceptance he is describing, distinct from both suppression on one side and unfiltered reaction on the other. The practice of self-responsibility. Branden considers this pillar essential to escaping what he sees as one of the most common traps in how people relate to their own lives, waiting for someone or something else to provide happiness, solutions, or validation, rather than accepting that ultimately, no one else is coming to solve your life for you. The specific claim is that self-responsibility is not primarily about blame, in either direction. It is about recognizing that regardless of how a difficult circumstance arose, whether through your own choices or through genuinely unfair external forces, the responsibility for what happens next belongs to you, because no one else is positioned to carry it on your behalf. A person who has not internalized this tends to experience their own life as something that happens to them, reacting rather than choosing. And Branden argues this passive orientation is directly corrosive to self-efficacy, since a mind that never fully owns its own decisions never gets the chance to build genuine confidence in making them well. He extends this specifically into relationships and work, arguing that self-responsibility includes taking ownership of your own goals, your own well-being, and your own behavior toward others, rather than making these implicitly someone else's job. A person who habitually expects a partner, an employer, or a friend to be responsible for their happiness is, in Branden's framing, quietly undermining their own self-esteem with every instance of that expectation, because it treats their own well-being as something outside their control, to be granted or withheld by someone else. He is careful to separate this from a harsher, more punitive reading some readers bring to the idea of responsibility, one that slides into self-blame for genuinely unfair circumstances. Branden's specific claim is narrower than that. Acknowledging unfairness accurately where it exists is part of living consciously, the first pillar. Self-responsibility begins after that acknowledgement, asking what you are now going to do about your situation, regardless of how it arose, rather than treating the unfairness itself as a reason further action is unnecessary or futile. The practice of self-assertiveness. This is the pillar Branden treats as most frequently avoided, because it directly confronts the discomfort of visibly representing your own needs, values, and positions honestly, especially when doing so risks disapproval or conflict. Self-assertiveness, in his definition, is not aggression. It is the willingness to be authentically yourself in your interactions with others, rather than habitually accommodating, self-erasing, or performing a version of yourself calculated to avoid friction. The specific mechanism he describes is that chronic self-suppression, agreeing when you disagree, staying silent about your actual preferences, consistently prioritizing others' comfort over your own honest expression, teaches the mind a specific and corrosive lesson, that your authentic self is not safe or acceptable to bring into the room. Repeated often enough, this pattern produces exactly the kind of low self-esteem it was originally meant to protect against, because the self being protected from disapproval is quietly being erased in the process of protecting it. Branden is careful to distinguish this from simple bluntness or disregard for others. Genuine self-assertiveness, in his view, still requires tact and consideration. The specific failure he is describing is not rudeness. It is the more common, quieter pattern of never actually showing up as yourself at all, so consistently accommodating that the people around you never encounter your real position on anything, and neither, over time, do you. He notes that this pattern is often mistaken for kindness, both by the person practicing it and by everyone around them, which makes it considerably harder to recognize as a problem than more obviously self-defeating behaviors. A person who has spent years being agreeable at the direct expense of honest expression is frequently praised for exactly the trait that is quietly hollowing out their own sense of self, which Branden treats as one of the more difficult aspects of this pillar to address, precisely because the surrounding social feedback tends to reinforce the very pattern that needs to change. The practice of living purposefully. Branden argues that self-esteem requires more than internal honesty and assertiveness. It requires evidence of competence, generated through the actual pursuit of meaningful goals, translated into action rather than left as intention. Living purposefully means identifying goals that genuinely matter to you and organizing your behavior in a sustained, disciplined way toward achieving them, rather than drifting through days reactively. The specific insight is that self-efficacy is not built through belief alone. It is built through accumulated evidence, actual instances of setting an intention and following through on it, however modest. A person who consistently starts projects and abandons them, or who never commits to goals specific enough to actually measure progress against, denies themselves exactly the kind of evidence self-efficacy requires, regardless of how much raw talent or potential they might otherwise have. He extends this to the broader structure of a life, arguing that purposeful living requires organizing not just individual projects but an overall sense of direction, so that daily actions connect to something larger than the immediate task in front of you. Without this larger structure, even genuine competence in isolated tasks tends to produce a strangely hollow form of self-esteem, technically capable, but disconnected from any sense that the capability is being used toward something the person actually cares about. He draws a specific distinction between activity and purpose that he considers frequently confused. Being busy, even productively busy, is not the same as living purposefully if the underlying goals were never consciously chosen in the first place, simply inherited from expectation or drifted into by default. Branden argues that a genuinely examined choice of direction, even a modest one, tends to produce more durable self-esteem than an impressive-looking schedule built around goals that were never actually the person's own. The practice of personal integrity. The final pillar addresses the alignment between stated values and actual behavior. Branden defines integrity specifically as the consistency between what you believe, what you say, and what you do, and he argues that violations of this consistency, even small, private ones that no one else ever discovers, carry a measurable psychological cost that most people underestimate. The specific mechanism is that every instance of behavior contradicting a stated value functions as evidence, registered internally, that your word and your actions cannot be fully trusted, even by yourself. This does not require dramatic hypocrisy to take effect. Small, repeated compromises, cutting a corner you privately consider unacceptable, saying something you do not believe to avoid friction, quietly accumulate the same way. And Branden argues this accumulation is one of the more common, least examined sources of chronically low self-esteem, precisely because each individual instance seems too minor to matter on its own. He is specific that integrity in this framework is not primarily a moral virtue performed for others. It is a psychological requirement for a stable sense of self, because a person who cannot rely on their own consistency between value and action has, in a very literal sense, undermined the internal trust that self-esteem is built from, regardless of how well that inconsistency is hidden from everyone else. Branden also notes a specific asymmetry worth nomming. Public integrity failures, the kind others witness and might judge, are often treated as the serious category worth worrying about, while private ones, decisions no one else will ever know about, are treated as essentially cost-free. His argument reverses this ranking entirely. The private violations, precisely because no external consequence forces them into conscious reckoning, are often the ones that accumulate longest and do the most quiet, unexamined damage to a person's underlying self-regard. Now let us be honest about this book, and about the broader research on self-esteem itself. Branden writes with genuine clinical authority, drawing on decades of work as a practicing psychotherapist, and the Six Pillars framework is considerably more rigorous and more actionable than the popular self-esteem movement he was reacting against. His core critique of that movement, that praise and affirmation without underlying competence, produce fragile, defensive self-regard rather than genuine self-esteem, has aged well and anticipated a body of later research that reached similar conclusions independently. That later research is worth engaging with directly, because it complicates the picture in ways the book, written in the mid-1990s, could not fully account for. A major review of the self-esteem literature conducted by psychologist Roy Baumeister and colleagues in the early 2000s found that the relationship between self-esteem and important life outcomes, academic performance, career success, relationship quality, was considerably weaker and more inconsistent than decades of popular enthusiasm had assumed. High self-esteem correlated reliably with feeling good, but the causal arrow toward actual achievement proved far harder to establish than expected, and in certain contexts, notably aggression and antisocial behavior, elevated self-esteem, particularly when it took an inflated or narcissistic form, showed troubling positive correlations rather than the protective effect the self-esteem movement had assumed. This matters for how to read Branden's framework specifically. His 6 pillars, grounded in actual competence, honest self-appraisal, and consistent action, are considerably closer to what this later research would recommend than the praise-based interventions he was criticizing, since genuine competence-based self-regard shows up in the research as more stable and less associated with these darker correlations than inflated or unearned self-esteem does. But the book still occasionally overstates self-esteem's causal power over life outcomes generally, treating it as a more central, singular driver of success and happiness than the more cautious, mixed picture in later empirical research fully supports. There is also a fair critique regarding the practical difficulty of the 6 pillars themselves. Branden describes each practice clearly, but offers comparatively little in the way of concrete, step-by-step method for actually building habits as demanding as consistent self-assertiveness or personal integrity, particularly for readers whose low self-esteem is itself the very thing making those practices difficult to begin in the first place. The book diagnoses the mechanism with real precision. The bridge from diagnosis to sustained daily practice is left considerably thinner than the diagnosis itself. None of this undermines the central, valuable reframing the book offers. Self-esteem is not a mood to be induced through external encouragement. It is closer to the byproduct of a specific set of internal practices, sustained over time, and no amount of praise from outside can substitute for the absence of those practices on the inside. So what do you actually take from this? The most immediately useful shift is recognizing which of the 6 pillars you personally tend to avoid. Most people are not equally weak across all 6. One or two tend to be the specific, recurring gap, whether that is consistently avoiding uncomfortable truths, chronically over-accommodating others at the expense of honest self-expression, or letting genuinely valued goals stay perpetually unstarted. Identifying your specific pattern is considerably more useful than treating self-esteem as one undifferentiated thing to simply improve in general. The second useful idea is the distinction between self-acceptance and self-approval. You do not need to approve of a mistake, a failure, or an uncomfortable feeling in order to accept, honestly, that it happened and that it came from you. The alternative to that honest acceptance is rarely higher standards. It is usually a cycle of avoidance followed by harsher private judgment, which tends to do considerably more damage to genuine self-esteem than the original imperfection ever would have on its own. The third takeaway concerns the specific, quiet cost of small integrity violations, the corners cut privately, the disagreements swallowed rather than voiced, the values stated but not consistently lived. None of these individually feels significant enough to matter. Branden's argument is that they accumulate anyway, registered internally regardless of whether anyone else ever notices, and that a surprising amount of chronically low self-regard traces back not to one dramatic failure, but to hundreds of small, unexamined inconsistencies between what a person believes and what they actually do. The fourth and final thing is simply this. Self-esteem in this framework was never something that could be handed to you by encouragement, certificates, or affirmations, however well-intentioned. It is closer to a structure you build, one honest observation, one difficult conversation, one kept commitment at a time, and like any other structure built this way, it tends to hold up considerably better under real pressure than anything assembled from praise alone ever could. Thanks for watching all the way through. The mirror was never going to say anything your actual behavior had not already decided for you first.